Hey everybody, we are moving on to our last civilization that we're going to look at in Mesoamerica. Just want you guys to know that we do have on Monday at 2 o'clock a full class meeting if you can make it. We put it on the Trailblazers Google Classroom so you can go to that Zoom meeting, and hopefully, wouldn't it be nice to have most of our team there, if not all of them? If you guys can make it, that would be great. And just a time for us to say hello to everybody, and maybe you can see the smiling faces of your classmates. But hey, we've made it through the Mayans. We found out that they lived in the top part of Mexico and had a great civilization till they were ran out by the Spanish. Then we went in with the Incas. They were also ran out by the Spanish, but they lived there in South America and in the hilly terrains of the Andes Mountains. They learned to farm along the mountainous terrain. And now we're moving on to the Aztecs, and they were farmers too, but they kind of did it in a different way. Pretty neat. We're going to talk about that here in just a second. But you can see that they live right here in this valley in Mexico. And in fact, their civilization really stretched from the Gulf of Mexico on this side all the way to the Pacific Ocean over here. So all through this valley. And you can see their capital city, which I won't even try and pronounce, but I always just say a capital that starts with a T and it's a long name. But that's right there in the middle of their civilization as well. And they were a people that were able to find a an area to farm in, but they farmed it a lot differently. Whenever I go to this next page, it's a little bit blurry, but I'll tell you what's happening. They lived in a swampy area, kind of in a lowland. They call it the valley, and in those swamps, they turned those swamps into floating gardens. And so they had these gardens that they built, and they had this big lake that they were around. And if they weren't on a lake, they were on a marsh. So they basically took these big sticks and laid them all out like long, like 300 feet long worth of sticks going sideways, checkerboard kind of like. And then they it turned out to be like a floating platform. They would put that out on the lake, put dirt on top of it, and then put their crops. They would plant their crops in there. I'll show you a picture of one right now. Hang on just a second. Hopefully my face isn't in the way of this too much, but this is basically what they look like. They would have these floating platforms. So they would build almost like a boat or a barge, just really flat. Then they would put the dirt and then they would plant their crops right through there. And these are trees that they would shove down through here, and then they would kind of pound that tree into the floor of the swamp so that the floating garden didn't really float away or anything. Um, they had really long ones. Like here's some that are like 300 feet long. People could go stand out there and garden on these, and they had a bunch of them. They really just kind of took the whole place. Here's a person. Let's see. Um, Hopefully my face isn't in the way of this. I tried to take my face off of this, but there's a person that goes up and down these in a canoe, kind of looking at the crops. Whenever they wanted to get in there and work, they would jump off their canoe and get on here and work. But that's what the Aztecs were really known for, floating gardens. The Mayans were known for religious rituals. The Incas were known for farming on a hillside on a mountain. And the Aztecs were known for farming on floating gardens. Pretty cool. So that's what their gardens look like. Anyway, so that's what this first one does. This is just a little story about an Aztec farmer that he doesn't have enough food at home, and that's kind of how they figured out how in the world are they going to farm, and they built these floating gardens. They call the floating gardens chanapas. Chanapas. They were weaving large rafts from reeds. The work was hard. They did it in the hot sun, but they were going to starve to death if they didn't figure out how in the world they were going to make these floating gardens out there. Eventually, they made them. Some were as big as 300 feet long and 15 to 30 feet wide. So that's a pretty good stretch to be gardening on. And like I said, it just floated out there. They drove them in with wooden stakes deep into the lake bed to keep them still. And they had 3 layers of soil. They would take the mud from the bottom and then put dirt on top, and then fresh mud and kind of layer it up to have nutrients for their plants. They had plenty of soil by digging it out of the bottom of that lake, and they could always replenish it, and they grew really well. Some of the things that they were growing in there were corn and beans. So corn was grown in the Mayans, it was grown in the Incas, and again, it was grown with the Aztecs. So they did all of that. So basically, the Aztecs, like we said, they settled in central Mexico. They were pretty much hunters and gatherers. Um, they eventually found that valley that they lived in and settled there into the Valley of Mexico. It says right here that they had plenty of fertile soil from their lakes. When they made their floating flower beds, they were very good as far as farming goes because they had this rich soil that came from the nutrients of the water, and it was also very easy to water their crops because it's actually just sitting there um, right on top of the water, so they could just grab water and put it on there. Um, they had city states. They had an empire, which we'll get to here pretty soon, but they had the city that I talk about, their capital city, Tenochtitlan. Probably not anywhere near that correct pronunciation, but it's the site of Mexico City today, so right there in the middle of Mexico. They had the land of their own. They adapted to the land. They adapted by turning a swamp into a place that they could actually farm in. And they had raised housing there as well, kind of housing on poles and stilts. So it was a very swampy land, but they were able to make use of it. They had warriors and rulers, and just like all the empires that we've talked about, they'll go around and take over people, and we'll talk about that eventually. When as far as adapting to the land, like I said, they were in a swamp. Those raised garden beds, they put them right on the lake called chinapas, and they had three main crops really: corn, squash, and chili peppers. They also hunted any animal that they found around the lake. So they ate meat, and they had a food supply right there on the lake that they were growing. So they had plenty of food, and their population grew. And at its height, they had between 200,000 and 400,000 people all living in a city-like area around that lake. They traded. That was a very important part of their economy. And they traded for goods that they couldn't get locally, especially wood and stone for building. So they would get out there and go and trade with other civilizations that had stone, and then they would take that back. They also dug canals for their canoes, and they loaded it up with things that they wanted to go trade, and they built things like bridges and riverways to get in and out of the mainlands. Um, they built an empire with their warrior skills, and it stretched all the way across Mexico, like I said, from the Gulf of Mexico all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And eventually, there were about between 6 million and 12 million people that were all ruled by the Aztecs. Now, the main Aztec civilization was between 2 and 400,000 that lived around their capital city. But if you take all the people in the area that the Aztecs said that they were in charge of, that would have been 6 to 12 million people. When they went and took over a land, like they would come in and say, "We're taking you over. We are the Aztecs and we mean business." And they would take them over, and the people, they'd say, "Well, we don't want to be Aztecs." And then they said, "Well, you can either be Aztecs or get beaten up." And then they're like, "Okay, well, we'll be an Aztec." And then once they were an Aztec, the Aztecs demanded that they pay them. So they said, "Now that you're an Aztec, you must give us a tribute." A tribute is right here, and that's a forced payment of things like corn, gold, and jade. So they would come in, take somebody over, and say, "Now you owe me money." And money to them was corn, gold, or jade. And they would say, "It's for the people. It's to make our area better." And people would be like, "Well, we're not paying it." And then they said, "Well, you got two choices. We will beat you up, or you're going to pay, or you're going to leave." Well, people didn't want to leave their land. They were basically taken over by this empire, and they paid up. So that's just a little taste of the Aztecs so far. The main thing that you need to know about them is they were able to live in a swampy area, have floating flower beds. that worked out really well, and their crops grew really well because of all this floating flower beds and or garden beds. And they eventually built a very strong empire that stretched all the way across the middle of Mexico. As we get into Aztecs a little bit more, we'll talk about their empire more tomorrow. But this is the Aztecs. Here we go. Thank you.